All right, now we're to the final step of the five-step process for revenue recognition. And so now we're basically to the step where we recognize the revenue as each performance obligation is satisfied. The key idea here is that the seller recognizes revenue when control of the good or service transfers to the buyer. Again, so if there's a separate performance obligation, when that obligation is satisfied and control or the benefit of that good or service transfers to the buyer, that's when the seller can recognize revenue. So in many cases, the transfer of control is pretty obvious, especially when we're talking about a good. For example, when a car dealership signs the title of a car over to the buyer, then control has moved over or transferred to the buyer, they can recognize the revenue related to that car sale. Or when a customer finalizes the purchase of a clothing item at a retail store, they have possession of the clothing item, they can recognize the revenue for that sale. But sometimes with the service, I guess with some goods it could be difficult, but with the service sometimes it's a little harder to think about. So when a sports team plays a game, control of watching the game transfers to the customer when the game is being played. And so as an example, we kind of used earlier, if there's an 8-game season where the team sells season tickets for 8 games, well, as each game is being played, the control over watching that game has transferred to the customer. And so you could recognize revenue with each game as it's being played. Or like when a lawn care company completes cutting the grass for a customer, basically control of any subsequent lawn care decisions lies with the customer. So they've completed their performance obligation. They can recognize the revenue with that lawn care service, even if there's more service that's to come, as long as there's a way to designate whatever they've done separately as a separate performance obligation, then they can recognize the revenue related to that. So there are some indicators that might show that transfer of control has taken place. These are indicators, these are not rules. But those indicators, first of all, if the company has a right to payment for an asset, that's an indication that there's been a transfer of control. If the company has transferred legal title, if the company has transferred physical possession of the asset, if the customer has now assumed significant risks and rewards related to ownership. That's another indication. And finally, if the customer has actually accepted the asset. Again, these are all indicators. I just want to be clear. These are not rules by any stretch. They're indications that transfer has taken place. And so if we have a performance obligation, just ask, has a transfer of control taken place with that performance obligation? If it has, then you can recognize the revenue related to that performance obligation.